September 1944. Fort Dean's Station, Massachusetts. The early autumn air, crisp and clear as crystal, was filled not with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, but with the scent of decaying leaves and distant chimney smoke from peaceful houses. It was intoxicating, this air, not just from its freshness, but from the feeling of something new, unknown, full of anxious uncertainty. With a long, weary metallic screech that echoed across the deserted platform, the military transport train pulled into the station. Behind its barred windows was a special cargo. 47 German women prisoners of war, each one a tangled knot of fear and despair. One of them was Greta Mueller. Pressing her forehead against the icy iron bars, she stared at the unfolding scene, her heart pounding wildly, ready to burst from her chest. For the last several years, her mind had been systematically processed by Nazi propaganda, which painted America in grim, apocalyptic tones. She had been promised a savage, bomb-scarred wasteland where embittered, half-starved people scurried among ruins, thirsting for revenge. American soldiers were depicted as ruthless sadists for whom torturing German female prisoners was a form of entertainment and a kind of sport. Reality dealt a crushing blow to this ingrained image. Instead of the expected hell, her eyes were met with soft, emerald green hills, cozy, undamaged houses with neat roofs, and peaceful citizens in clean, sturdy clothing, going about their business unhurriedly. Somewhere in the distance, at the edge of a clearing, children were playing. Their carefree laughter reached the carriage, sounding like a mockery of everything she knew about the war. This world wasn't just existing. It was thriving, living a full, normal life, as if there was no global slaughter at all. And then something happened that completely overturned all her preconceptions. A group of American soldiers approached the carriage. But in their hands were no weapons, no shackles, not even threatening expressions. They carried simple tin cups, from which light steam rose. Water. Just water. Wasser? One of them said, a young man struggling with the German words. His voice was calm, even soft. You must be thirsty after the long journey. Greta's hands trembled. Inside her, years of brainwashing fought a simple, animal thirst. Whispers from the other women, full of fear and distrust, came from the darkness of the carriage. "It's a trap," hissed Ingrid Weber, a staunch adherent of Nazi ideology. "They want to poison us or lull us into a false sense of security. Don't take it." But something in that soldier's eyes, an insignificant spark of simple human kindness she hadn't expected to see here, made her reach out a trembling hand and accept the cup. The water was cool, clean, and incredibly tasty. It was more than just a drink. It was the first stone knocked out from the foundation of the wall of her prejudices. The processing in the camp became a new round of revelations for Greta. Instead of the expected humiliation and violence, she was met by Captain Margaret Walsh, an American nurse of Irish descent whose external sternness hid a deep, genuine empathy. Captain Walsh spoke to them in broken but diligent German, explaining the camp rules with a patience bordering on tenderness. You will receive 3 meals a day, medical help when needed, and the opportunity to write letters home, she said, and her words sounded like a fairy tale. No one will harm you here. That evening, settled on her narrow bunk in the barracks, Greta listened to the whispers of her fellow prisoners. The fear sown by propaganda was a weed not easily uprooted. "Don't trust them," insisted Ingrid from the next bunk. "My brother, before he left for the Eastern Front, warned me. The Americans are sophisticated in their cruelty. They give you hope in order to crush you later." But it wasn't these words that kept Greta awake. It was the letter from home she had received during processing. Her mother's neat handwriting described a different reality. Another bombing raid on Hamburg, the death of neighbors, destroyed houses, food ration cards that were barely enough to avoid starvation. It was a narrative of suffering and despair that stood in stark contrast to the clean bed, adequate food, and basic human dignity she had already experienced in one day of American captivity. The realization overwhelmed her so powerfully it took her breath away. Perhaps here, in the enemy's captivity, she was safer than her own family, free citizens in Germany. The irony was suffocating, the feeling of guilt, oppressive. While she slept on a real mattress and drank clean water, her mother and sister were huddling in bomb shelters, not knowing if they would survive the next night. This knowledge became her secret burden, a heavy load she carried alone in the darkness of the barracks. And outside, the sounds of peaceful American life could be heard. The noise of cars on the road, music from a radio, the laughter of soldiers on guard duty. These were the sounds of a world that still believed in tomorrow. 3 days later, Greta was assigned to work in the camp hospital. This appointment became a transition to a different reality for her, where her skills acquired in the German Red Cross suddenly became more important than her status as an enemy prisoner. Captain Walsh, having studied her file, saw in her not a nationality, but a specialist. And so Greta was once again doing what she did best, caring for those who needed healing. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and hope, a stark contrast to the makeshift medical stations in Germany. Here, the cabinets were crammed with medicines, bandages were clean and in abundance, and help was given based on need, not political views. One morning, a commotion broke out in the corner where the German children, the offspring of other prisoners, were housed. A 2-year-old toddler had fallen ill overnight and was now screaming incessantly, despite his mother's desperate attempts to calm him. Captain Walsh, with her medical acumen, quickly assessed the situation, but every attempt to examine the child was met with deafening screams of terror. To the feverish boy, the American in uniform was a frightening monster. "He won't let me near him," Captain Walsh said quietly to Greta, and her voice held a mix of frustration and genuine anxiety. "His temperature is dangerously high." Greta, without thinking, approached the cot and began to sing. A quiet, ancient German lullaby that her mother used to sing to her younger brother filled the ward. The melody was simple but timeless, passed down through generations of mothers comforting their children. The child's crying subsided, his feverish gaze fixed on Greta with the unconditional trust only children can offer. Continuing to sing, she gently placed a cool, damp cloth on the boy's forehead, her movements precise and tender. Soon, she managed to persuade him to drink and then to allow Captain Walsh to examine him. Captain Walsh watched this metamorphosis in silence, and Greta felt something shift in the American woman's perception. For the first time, she was being looked at not as an enemy or a prisoner, but as a woman who knew how to calm a frightened child. "You have a way with children," Captain Walsh said later as they washed medical instruments together. "You have experience." "I helped raise my younger sister," Greta replied in broken English, surprised at her own candor. "And in the Hamburg hospital we saw many children. War makes everyone fearful." A tentative but real dialogue began between them, two medics finding common ground in their calling to heal. Meanwhile, outside the camp, Dorothy Hayes, the owner of a small bakery, was making her weekly bread deliveries to the camp kitchen. This contract provided her with a steady income and a sense of contributing to the war effort. Her son, Jimmy, had been killed at the Normandy landings. Until now, she had deliberately avoided looking at the German prisoners, not wanting to see faces that could shake the solid structure of her grief. But that morning, carrying baskets of bread past the hospital window, she inadvertently witnessed a scene that struck her to the core. A young prisoner with a concentrated and kind face was tenderly bandaging another woman's wound. Her movements held the same caring attentiveness that Dorothy had seen in her son when he picked up fledglings or comforted toddlers who had fallen. The recognition was painful and inescapable. The enemy prisoner possessed the same essential kindness that had defined her Jimmy. Dorothy turned away, but the image haunted her all the way home. How could the enemy show such tenderness? How could a person raised under Nazi ideology demonstrate the same gentle care that made her son special? That same evening, Greta made a small but important discovery for herself. On her way from the hospital to the barracks, she noticed a small, shiny object in the dust by the fence. An American penny, polished to a copper shine. She picked it up with reverent awe. In Germany, coins had been made of cheap alloy for years. All copper went to the war effort. This tiny coin was minted from real, substantial copper, which spoke eloquently of an abundance unheard of to her. Such a trifle, and yet how much it meant. Greta hid the penny in her pocket, where it became for her tangible proof of the falsity of all Nazi propaganda about American poverty and despair. Lying on her bunk that night, clutching the warmed coin in her palm, Greta began to understand that her captivity was perhaps teaching her not just survival, but how to truly see the world for the first time in her life. Expansion and deepening. New facets of reality. The daily routine began. Life in the camp was subject to a strict schedule, but even in this regulated routine, Greta found food for thought. Working in the hospital became an outlet for her. She recalled skills, learned new medical terms in English from Captain Walsh. A kind of professional camaraderie, a silent respect, developed between them, breaking through the barriers of language and status. One day, as they were together treating a complex wound on the hand of a young prisoner injured during the bombing of her convoy, Captain Walsh said quietly, "You are a good nurse, Muller. Very careful." That simple phrase was worth more than any praise in her past life. Dorothy Hayes, meanwhile, was waging her own quiet war with herself. The image of the German nurse wouldn't leave her mind. She began to notice other prisoners during her visits. They didn't resemble the fanatical fury from the posters. Some were very young, with frightened eyes. Others were older women whose hands were probably more accustomed to holding a rolling pin than a rifle. One day, she saw a group of prisoners, under guard, working in the camp vegetable garden, harvesting late vegetables. One of them, a gray-haired woman, adjusted a slipped headscarf on her neighbor, and this gesture of simple human concern again reminded Dorothy of Jimmy. She began to catch herself feeling that her patriotic fury was gradually being eroded by compassion, and this frightened her more than hatred. There were internal storms within the camp, too. Ingrid Weber was not appeased. She created a small circle of like-minded women around her who viewed everything American with suspicion. They whispered in the corner of the barracks, calling Greta and others who had made contact traitors and duped fools. Ingrid tried to sabotage work in the hospital by feigning misunderstanding of orders and constantly spoke of the imminent exposure of American treachery. Her rhetoric resonated with those who were too frightened to trust and whose families were in Reich-controlled territory. The atmosphere in the barracks grew tense at times, dividing the women into two unofficial camps. One cold October evening, unable to sleep, Greta quietly left the barracks on the pretext of getting a breath of air near the sentry post. She stood, wrapped in a thin blanket, and looked at the stars, the same ones that shone over Hamburg. Suddenly, her attention was caught by a faint sound. From the window of a nearby administrative building came music. Someone inside was listening to a classical melody on the radio. Beethoven. The paradox struck her. Here, in the heart of the enemy country, she was hearing the music of her greatest composer, while at home, his work, like everything German that didn't fit Nazi canons, could be declared degenerate. The irony was bitter and multi-layered. The climax of rapprochement and public backlash. The idea of a cultural exchange, proposed by Captain Walsh, gradually took shape into a concrete plan. It was to be a modest event, a few tables in a common room where the prisoners could demonstrate their skills to local residents. Embroidery, wood carving, traditional baking. Captain Walsh believed that such bridges between cultures were the seeds of a future peace. Dorothy, to her own surprise, threw herself into the organization. She arranged for supplies of extra flour and sugar, helped find fabrics for the embroiderers. In this activity, she found a semblance of comfort, feeling that she was doing something Jimmy, who had always been interested in other cultures, would have liked. Greta enthusiastically set about making her wooden angels. In every stroke, every smooth line of the chisel was a particle of her longing for home, for a peaceful life, for beauty devoid of utilitarian meaning. The angels turned out different, but in each one could be discerned a striving for something bright and eternal. However, rumors of the planned event leaked beyond the camp, and the reaction was not long in coming. At first, it was sidelong glances in Dorothy's direction when she entered a shop. Then came angry letters to the local newspaper. "Shame," wrote outraged citizens. "While our boys are dying in Europe, we are organizing craft fairs with Nazi women." A storm of public condemnation fell upon Dorothy. She was called a traitor, a mother who has dishonored her son's memory. Some regular customers turned away from her. Old friends stopped calling. The pressure reached such a pitch that the camp command, fearing a scandal, officially canceled the event. The announcement was made dryly and without explanation, but everyone understood. The cancellation was a heavy blow to everyone. For the prisoners who had allowed themselves to hope for normal human interaction, it was a bitter disappointment. For Greta, it was the collapse of the fragile bridges she had begun to build. She put her unfinished angels away in a box under her bunk, feeling foolish and deceived. The triumph of Ingrid and her supporters was silent but palpable. For Dorothy, the darkest days had come. The loneliness became almost physically palpable. She sat in her empty cafe and looked at Jimmy's photograph. Doubts gnawed at her from the inside. Maybe they were all right. Maybe her attempt to find the human in the enemy was a betrayal of her son's memory? It was at this moment of despair that she committed that very act. Taking Jimmy's worn German-English dictionary from the table, she drove to the camp. "I want to see the one who works in the hospital," she told the guard at the gate, holding herself with feigned confidence. "I have something that might help her write letters home." Their meeting in the small visitation room was tense and silent at first. Dorothy placed the dictionary on the table. "Your son?" Greta asked quietly, pointing to the name written in pencil on the end paper. Dorothy nodded. "Jimmy. He was 21. He was killed in Normandy." Silence hung between them, thick and saturated with grief. And then Greta, swallowing tears, told her about her brother Carl, who hadn't died in battle, but had died of typhus in the trenches near Stalingrad, just a boy. Their conversation, at first timid and fragmented, gradually gained strength. They talked about loss, about memory, about fears for those left at home. Dorothy, rummaging in her purse, pulled out a bundle of Jimmy's letters. She began to read excerpts, struggling for words, checking the dictionary. Jimmy wrote about sharing his rations with a wounded German soldier, about trying to teach him a few English phrases so he could ask for help. "Your son?" Greta said slowly, searching for the words. "He saw a person, not just a uniform." In that moment, something broke. Two women, separated by war, propaganda, and personal tragedy, found in each other not an enemy, but a kindred spirit who had also known the pain of loss. Dorothy gave Greta the dictionary. This gesture was not just an act of kindness, it was an act of reconciliation, hard-won and genuine. As Dorothy drove away from the camp, her heart was overflowing. The grief had not gone away, but a new, strange feeling had been added to it. Not forgiveness, but understanding. The understanding that war is a tragedy for everyone it touches, and that Jimmy's memory could be honored not only with hatred, but also by preserving the kindness that had been in him himself. And Greta, returning to the barracks, took the box of angels from under her bunk. They no longer seemed to her a symbol of naivety. Now they were a reminder that, even in the darkest circumstances, a spark of humanity can be found, and that this spark is worth fighting for. She picked up one of the angels and set to work to finish it. She had a feeling it was important. Perhaps it was her tiny contribution to the idea that someday, somewhere, peace might finally come.